It came to a terrible end. He was alive inside that wreckage, pinned in the cockpit, his neck broken, fire beginning to crawl around him. He could not move. He could not feel his own body below the neck. But the first thing he said was not about himself. He looked toward the two men who had walked away from that crash, and he gasped out the words, "Are you guys okay?" That was how it ended for the captain of the New York Yankees. But to understand how he ended up in that burning cockpit, you have to understand everything that came before. Because the crash was the end of the story. It was not the story itself. This is the life, the pressure, the love, and the terrible final moments of Thurman Munson, the man who held an entire franchise together and could not find anyone to hold him. If you are a baseball fan and this already hits you, use the hype feature on this video right now so more people can hear what really happened to number 15. Thurman Lee Munson was not the kind of man who walked into a room and made everyone turn their heads. He was not tall in the movie star way. He was not smooth. He did not have an easy smile or a gift for giving the media what they wanted. He was stocky, compact, and intense. The kind of player whose greatness you felt before you could fully explain it. He crouched behind the plate with a focus that bordered on something deeper than concentration. He studied pitchers. He studied hitters. He read situations the way some people read books, fast and fully, without needing to go back and look again. He was a catcher, and not just any catcher. He was, by the time the 1970s were in full swing, one of the best catchers in the game, maybe the best. He called pitches with the sophistication of a chess master. He handled a pitching staff the way a general handles an army, putting each piece exactly where it needed to be, remembering every hitter's weakness, every pitcher's best pitch in a two-strike count, every situation that the game could throw at him. He had absorbed those details by watching and listening and competing at the highest level for years. And he did not forget any of it. He hit for average when it mattered, and hit for extra bases when the game demanded it. He was relentless at the plate in October, hitting 357 in postseason play across his career, a number that is extraordinary for any position and almost unheard of for a catcher, absorbing that level of physical punishment every single day of the season. In 1976, the New York Yankees did something they had not done since Lou Gehrig was still alive. They named a team captain. They looked at their roster, full of talented players and enormous personalities, and they chose Thurman Munson. Not a slugger, not a headline maker, not the guy on the magazine covers. They chose the gruff, hard-nosed catcher from Canton, Ohio, who led by doing and not by talking. That tells you something important. When you want to know who really runs the room, you watch who the room listens to when things get hard. The Yankees listened to Munson. He batted .292 for his career across 11 seasons. His career WAR, which is the number analysts use to measure how many wins above a replacement player someone is worth, sat at 46.1. He won the American League Rookie of the Year award in 1970, arriving in New York as a fully formed professional before most young players have figured out how to handle a big league curveball. He won the American League Most Valuable Player award in 1976, leading the Yankees to their first pennant in over a decade. He led that team to back-to-back World Series championships in 1977 and 1978. He won a Gold Glove Award for his defense behind the plate. He was everything a franchise could want in a leader, and he delivered it year after year while carrying more personal weight than anyone watching from the stands could have known. But there was always something churning underneath all of it. Something that drove him harder than winning alone could explain. Something that made him desperate to close the 400-mile gap between New York and Canton. Something that made him willing to fly a jet he was not completely ready for, exhausted, in pain, season after season, just to be home with his wife and his 3 children for whatever hours the schedule would allow. To understand Thurman Munson, you have to understand what kind of man he was trying to become. And to understand that, you have to understand the man who failed to raise him. His father was named Darrell Munson. Darrell drove trucks for a living, long-haul routes that kept him away from home for long stretches at a time. When Darrell was around, the warmth you might hope for was not there. He did not encourage his son the way a father is supposed to. He did not build Thurman up. The reports that came from people close to the family described Darrell as not just distant, but actively critical. He did not simply withhold affirmation. He tore it down. Think about what that does to a child. Thurman was growing up trying to be good at something, trying to find something he could bring home and say, "Look what I did," hoping that this time, finally, the response would be different. It never was. The approval never came. The pride never showed. Darrell kept the door closed. And then Thurman got really good at baseball. Not just good, exceptional. He went to Kent State University and dominated. He got drafted by the Yankees. He rose quickly through the minor leagues. He arrived in the major leagues and was immediately one of the best young players in the game. He won the American League Rookie of the Year award in 1970. He became the anchor of a franchise being rebuilt into a dynasty. And still, his father was unimpressed. In 1976, the year Thurman won the MVP award, the year the Yankees won the pennant, the year everything Thurman had worked his entire life to achieve actually happened, his father reportedly continued to criticize him, continued to find fault. The approval Thurman had been chasing since childhood remained just out of reach, sitting behind a door that Darryl simply refused to open. What that does to a man is complicated. It creates someone who works harder than everyone around him, because the hunger is not just for success. It is for something older and deeper than success. It is for proof that he is enough. At the same time, it creates someone who does not trust praise, because praise had never come from the one place he needed it. It creates someone who keeps people at a distance, because closeness always carried the risk of disappointment. It creates someone who builds walls and calls them character and dares you to knock them down. The media called those walls surly. They called Thurman gruff and uncooperative and difficult to deal with. They described his interviews as painful and his personality as prickly. Some reporters gave up trying to build a relationship with him entirely, and the more they pulled back, the more his reputation calcified. He was protective of his privacy. He was deeply suspicious of what reporters actually wanted when they came around. He had grown up with a father who knew exactly who he was and still found ways to criticize him. So why would a stranger with a notebook be any different? When he felt that his teammates were being treated unfairly by the press, he sometimes refused to speak at all. When he thought a question was designed to make him look bad, he shut down. None of that came from nowhere. It came from Darryl. Every wall Thurman built for the media had its foundation in that childhood kitchen somewhere in Canton, Ohio, waiting for a father who either was not there or was not saying what needed to be said. The painful irony is what this did to his legacy. The writers who covered baseball were also the men who voted on the Baseball Hall of Fame. Thurman's 7-year peak WAR of 37.0 is actually higher than the average for catchers who are currently inducted. His postseason numbers were extraordinary. His leadership was as real as the trophies the franchise won during his years behind the plate. By the numbers, the case for Thurman Munson in the Hall of Fame is not close. It is overwhelming. But numbers do not vote. People vote. And the people who vote had been sitting in that press box for years, trying to get a word out of number 15 and going home empty. The perception of him as difficult, as not the right kind of person to celebrate, became a weight on his legacy that statistical analysis is still struggling to lift. His absence from Cooperstown remains one of the most frustrating injustices in the history of the sport for anyone who takes the time to actually look at what he accomplished. His teammates never saw him that way. To the men who shared that clubhouse with him, Thurman was the guy who walked over to the struggling rookie and said something quiet and true at exactly the right moment. He was the guy who stayed late to study film when everyone else had gone home. He was the guy you wanted in the dugout when the game was on the line, not because he gave speeches, but because he went out and did things. He earned the trust of every man in that room, the same way he earned everything else in his life, by showing up and doing the work. He smothered his 3 children with affection. His wife Diane was often the one who held the discipline side of things, the practical, day-to-day structure that a household with kids requires. But Thurman wanted to be the emotional core. He wanted to be the parent who was warm and present and completely there. He was building, deliberately and consciously, the exact opposite of the childhood he had lived. Every game of catch, every evening at the dinner table, every hour he could carve out of the relentless schedule of a Major League Baseball season. He was trying to give his kids everything Darryl had never given him. The problem was the season. The season lasted from spring through October if the team was good. The Yankees were good. The season ate months of his life and kept him a long way from Ohio. And as the years wore on and his body started telling him things he did not want to hear, the distance became something he could not simply accept. He needed a solution. He needed something that put him in the driver's seat instead of at the mercy of commercial flight schedules. He needed to fly himself. When Reggie Jackson signed with the New York Yankees before the 1977 season, it was one of the biggest moments in the recent history of the franchise. Jackson was a legitimate superstar. He had won championships in Oakland. He had power at the plate that was among the best in the game. He could carry a lineup in October in ways that most players never get close to. He was exactly the kind of talent that franchises spend decades trying to acquire. But Thurman already had a team. He had built something. He had been part of taking the Yankees from the bottom of the American League back to the top. He had done it as the captain, the quiet center of the operation, the man who made everyone around him better without ever asking for credit. The Yankees did not win those pennants because Thurman Munson was getting magazine covers. They won because he was crouching behind the plate in April and June and September, reading every situation, calling every pitch, driving the car when the road was hardest. And then Reggie arrived with his magazine covers. Before Jackson had even played a regular season game in a Yankees uniform, an interview hit the stands that set the tone for everything that followed. In it, Reggie described himself as the straw that stirs the drink. He said that Munson could stir it too, but that Munson would just have to stir it himself. The words landed in the clubhouse like something thrown through a window. To Thurman and the players who had been there through the hard years, it was not just arrogance. It was erasure. A man who had not yet done anything for this team was claiming credit for the drink that other people had mixed. Thurman was furious. He felt that Jackson was an outsider who had walked in and immediately tried to plant a flag in territory that belonged to someone else. He felt that the old guard, the men who had bled for this organization, were being dismissed. He carried the responsibility of protecting that identity as captain, and it added a layer of stress to an already demanding role. What makes the whole situation complicated is that they won. The Yankees won the World Series in 1977. They won it again in 1978. Jackson delivered one of the most iconic individual performances in World Series history in 1977, hitting 3 home runs on 3 straight pitches in Game 6. And Thurman was right there, catching every game, calling every pitch, doing what he had always done, which was everything necessary to win. 2 men who did not like each other and could not fully respect each other's way of operating, finding a way to be champions together, because the only thing stronger than their dislike for each other was their shared need to win. That is a complicated kind of greatness, and it belonged to both of them. The 2 men never became close. The friction never fully dissolved. But they found a way to channel it into championships, which is its own kind of testament to what both of them were as competitors. What it cost Thurman internally to share a clubhouse with someone he felt had disrespected the institution he gave everything to protect, we cannot fully know, but it was real. It showed up in how he talked and how he carried himself. And it was one more thing pressing down on a man who was already carrying more than most people would recognize. He was also carrying Carlton Fisk. The rivalry between Munson and Fisk was different from the Jackson situation. It was not internal politics. It was a war of position, a clash of personalities, and the engine of one of the most heated rivalries in American sports. Fisk was the Boston Red Sox catcher, and in the 1970s, that meant he and Munson were occupying the same piece of baseball territory in 2 different uniforms. They were competing not just for wins, but for the claim to being the best catcher in the American League. And neither man was willing to concede anything. Fisk was everything the media rewarded. He was tall and clean-cut and media-friendly. He was the face of the Red Sox in a market that loved its baseball team with a devotion that bordered on religious. The Boston press treated him like royalty. He became one of the most recognizable figures in the sport. When cameras were around, Fisk knew how to handle them. To Thurman, watching Fisk get that treatment felt familiar in the worst possible way. The polished, presentable one gets the attention. The harder-working, rougher one gets overlooked. He had been living that story his whole life. Their rivalry came to a head on August 1st, 1973. At Fenway Park. It was the 9th inning. The game tied at 2. The Yankees were running a squeeze play, a bunt designed to bring a runner home. The bunt was missed. The runner was Thurman Munson, and he was coming home at full speed with no intention of stopping. He barreled into Fisk at home plate. The collision was not just a play. It was an explosion of years of pent-up competition between 2 men who had been measuring themselves against each other for years. Both catchers were ejected. Both benches emptied. The brawl lasted nearly 10 minutes and was described afterward by Red Sox pitcher Bill Lee as looking like 2 hookers fighting on 45th Street. It was a raw and violent image that somehow captured exactly what that rivalry looked and felt like at its most unguarded. 2 professionals who had stopped pretending to be anything other than what they were, which was 2 men who absolutely refused to lose to each other. What happened after Thurman died tells you what was really underneath all of it. Carlton Fisk said publicly that Munson's death was a great loss for baseball. He said their rivalry had been purely professional. He said he wished they could have known each other away from the diamond. There was genuine respect in those words. 2 men who pushed each other to the absolute limit, who refused to show weakness in front of each other, who fought with everything they had every single time they met. And underneath that, a recognition that what they had shared was something most people never get to experience. That was the kind of competitor Thurman Munson was. Even the people who hit him hardest respected him when the mask was off. By the start of the 1979 season, Thurman's body had started to fall apart in ways that could not be hidden or managed out of. He had been catching professionally for over a decade. That means thousands of deep squats behind the plate, crouching down and exploding back up hundreds of times every game, for hundreds of games, year after year. That is what catching does to a human body. The knees absorb the constant pressure of the squat. The fingers absorb the foul tips. The chest absorbs the collisions. The entire lower half of the body gets hammered by the daily grind of the most physically demanding position in the sport. Munson had caught over 10,000 innings at the professional level. By 1979, the wear on his knees was not just soreness or stiffness. It was structural. The chronic inflammation that had been building for years had essentially destroyed his mobility. He was playing in near constant pain. The explosive lower body movement that had made him one of the most athletic catchers in the game was no longer available to him the way it once was. He was managing, not performing, getting through, not thriving. The statistics show what was happening. In 1975, he hit 12 home runs and drove in 102 runs while posting a WAR of 6.6. In 1976, the MVP year, the numbers were similar in power and impact. In 1977, he hit 18 home runs and drove in 100 runs. And then the bottom fell out. In 1978, he hit 6 home runs and drove in 71 runs, with his WAR dropping to 3.2. By 1979, in the 97 games he played before the crash, he had 3 home runs and 39 RBI, with a WAR of 2.2. That is not a player in decline because he stopped caring. That is a player whose body stopped being able to do what his mind was still telling it to do. The lower body drive that generates power for a hitter comes from the legs and the hips. When the knees go, the power goes. He could still get on base. He could still hit for average. But the version of Thurman Munson who hit 18 home runs was gone. The Yankees knew it. There were serious internal conversations about what to do with him. First base was discussed as a permanent move. The designated hitter role came up. The idea was to save his legs, to extend his career by removing the daily torture of catching from his routine. Munson had always pushed back against the idea of leaving the position that had defined him. Being a catcher was not just a job description to him. It was his identity. It was the whole architecture of who he was in that sport. Every defensive decision, every pitch call, every relationship he had built with the pitching staff, it all flowed from being the man behind the plate. To step away from that was to step away from himself. But by 1979, he was beginning to understand that this transition was not optional. It was inevitable, and probably sooner than he wanted to admit. He was still brilliant behind the plate in the ways that did not show up in the numbers. He still called games with sophistication that younger catchers would spend careers trying to replicate. He was still the captain, still the leader, still the man the Yankees needed in that dugout. But the physical foundation underneath everything was crumbling. And the urgency this created around family time, around being present, around closing the distance between New York and Canton while he still had a career and a body that functioned, was becoming almost unbearable. Every ache was a countdown. Every painful step off the bench was a reminder that his time in uniform was running shorter. He needed to be home. He needed to be with his wife Diane and his 3 kids. He needed those hours that the baseball schedule kept taking from him. He had started flying his own aircraft specifically to get those hours back. And as 1979 wore on, that commitment deepened into something that the people closest to him were starting to find alarming. Getting a pilot's license had not been a vanity project for Thurman Munson. He was not doing it to impress anyone or to signal that he had made it. He was doing it because his family was in Canton, Ohio, and his career was in New York, New York. And commercial airline schedules during baseball season were not built for a man who needed to be somewhere else on every available off day. He needed control over that equation. He needed to be able to say, "The Yankees are off tomorrow. I am going home tonight," without waiting for a flight that might not exist at the right time. He started with propeller planes. He took lessons. He logged hours. He got his license and developed real comfort with smaller aircraft. And then, relatively quickly, he made a jump that aviation experts would later look back on with significant concern. He purchased a Cessna Citation 501. The tail number was N15NY, his jersey number combined with his team. This was not a small propeller plane. It was a high-performance jet aircraft that required a significantly higher level of technical proficiency to fly safely. The speeds were higher. The systems were more complex. The margins for error were smaller. The consequences of small mistakes were more severe. Teammates noticed. Lou Piniella, one of the men who knew Munson best, was deeply unsettled by the new jet. He and Bobby Mercer spent hours in the days leading up to August 2nd, 1979, trying to talk Thurman out of continuing to fly it. Piniella was direct. He told Munson to sell the plane. He said that Munson's physical exhaustion from the season was a dangerous variable in a jet that required what he described as total focus. Mercer had the same fears. These were not outsiders expressing general worry. These were men who knew Thurman's physical state, who saw him every day, who understood exactly how worn down he was by the summer of 1979. Even George Steinbrenner weighed in. Steinbrenner was himself a pilot. He knew aircraft. He told Munson that the Cessna Citation was harder to fly than a Learjet, and that Munson had not spent enough time in training for a machine of this type. That was not a casual observation. That was a pilot looking at another pilot and saying that the gap between what you know and what this plane requires is wider than you think. Munson heard all of it, and he kept flying. His pilot's license meant something to him beyond transportation. It represented independence. It represented control over the one variable that baseball kept taking from him, which was time with his children. To tell him to stop flying felt, to Thurman, like telling him to stop being a father on the terms he had chosen. So he brushed off the concerns, and he kept going up. By late July 1979, the pattern was fully established. Every off day the Yankees had, Munson flew back to Canton. He was maximizing family time as aggressively as he could. He was also, without fully acknowledging it, even to himself, putting a physically depleted man into a demanding cockpit over and over again during the worst stretch of physical decline in his career. On August 2nd, 1979, the Yankees had an off day. Munson drove to Akron-Canton Airport. He was not making a family trip. He was there to practice. The exercise he was working on was called touch-and-go landings. This is a standard training maneuver where the pilot lands the aircraft and then, without coming to a full stop, pushes the throttle forward and takes off again immediately. It is how pilots sharpen their approach and landing technique, by repeating the sequence over and over. Done correctly, it requires precise control of the plane's speed on approach and careful management of the flaps, which are the movable sections on the wing that help generate lift at lower speeds. 2 men were with him in the aircraft. Jerry Anderson was a certified flight instructor. David Hall was a friend and fellow pilot. Under any normal analysis, having a certified flight instructor in the cockpit should mean that someone is there to catch problems before they become disasters. But what actually happened reveals a very human failure inside that aircraft. Anderson later testified that he did not feel comfortable telling the owner of the plane that he was flying poorly, so he held back. He deferred to Munson. He watched and stayed quiet when his expertise told him something was wrong. The sequence of events that followed was a cascade of small errors that built on each other until there was no room left to recover. Earlier in the session, Munson had silenced a warning horn related to the landing gear and failed to re-engage it afterward. On the final approach, he failed to extend the flaps. This was a critical error. Flaps are essential at low speeds because they increase the amount of lift the wings can generate. Without flaps extended, the plane needs to fly faster to stay in the air safely. Munson was flying at a speed that was appropriate for a flap-extended configuration, but dangerously slow for the actual configuration the aircraft was in. The jet began to sink faster than it should have been sinking. Not dramatically at first, just a gradual, steady descent that was coming in a little too steep, a little too fast. Both Hall and Anderson felt it. They described the sensation in their later depositions as the plane settling in, as if it were sinking through the air, rather than gliding down to the runway the way it was supposed to. By the time Munson recognized the danger and pushed the throttles forward to maximum power, it was too late. A jet engine does not respond instantly when you shove the throttle forward. The turbines take several seconds to build up to the thrust level needed to counteract a stall. In an aircraft at low altitude on final approach, those seconds are not available. There was not enough runway left. There was not enough sky left. There was nothing left to do. The aircraft hit the ground approximately 1,000 feet short of the runway threshold. It skidded through a grove of trees, shearing off branches and absorbing impact after impact. It struck a large tree stump that spun the airframe around and brought it to rest on a road just outside the airport boundary. The tail registration, N15NY, his number, his team, the machine he had called his ticket home, came to rest in the dirt. Hall and Anderson got out. They were essentially uninjured. Thurman was not. The instrument panel had been driven back into the cockpit by the force of the impact, pinning his lower body in the seat. The crash had broken his neck. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He could not free himself. He could not feel his legs. He could not push away from the panel that was holding him in place. Fire began to come from the fuel tanks in the wings. Hall and Anderson pulled at him. They reached through the emergency exit and they pulled with everything they had, trying to drag him free. The cockpit was filling with smoke. The heat was rising. And through all of it, Thurman Munson was conscious. He was awake. He could think. He could speak. His first concern was for his friends. Even pinned in a burning aircraft with a broken neck and no feeling below his shoulders, the first thing Thurman Munson said was a question for the 2 men who had walked away. "Are you guys okay?" The fire grew stronger. Hall kept pulling. And as the flames got closer and the smoke got thicker and the situation became something that no amount of will could overcome, Thurman asked for a fire extinguisher. And then, in the last moment before the heat forced everyone back, he spoke his final words. "Help me, Dave." The fire became too intense for Hall and Anderson to stay. Their own clothes were beginning to catch as they tried to hold their position. They had to retreat. They left their captain in that cockpit. The rescue crews that arrived minutes later could not get close enough either. Thurman Munson died on August 2nd, 1979. He was 32 years old. George Steinbrenner, a man who was not known for being easily broken by anything, was inconsolable. The news traveled through the Yankees organization like a physical shock. Players stood in silence. Coaches sat with their faces in their hands. The team played their next few games in a fog, going through the motions while trying to process something that did not process easily. Ron Guidry, the ace of the staff and one of Thurman's closest friends on the mound, was seen sobbing openly in the dugout. The locker at Yankee Stadium sat empty. Number 15 disappeared from any jersey worn by any player on the team. Steinbrenner announced immediately that Munson's number would never be worn again by a Yankee. It was not a policy. It was a declaration. The catcher's equipment that had been his was not distributed or repurposed. The space where he had gotten dressed before thousands of games simply stopped being used. That emptiness said something that a speech could not. It said that what was lost was not replaceable, that some gaps are not meant to be filled. The true emotional release came on August 6, 1979. The entire Yankees team attended Thurman Munson's funeral in Canton, Ohio in the morning. They flew to Canton to say goodbye to their captain, and then they flew back to New York the same day because there was a game that night against the Baltimore Orioles on national television. Bobby Mercer had stood at that funeral and delivered one of the eulogies. He had spoken about his friend, about the man he had known and loved as a teammate and as a person. And then, hours later, he put on his uniform and walked to the plate in a game that no one in that stadium could have fully been present for. Because grief is not something that turns off when the first pitch is thrown. What Mercer did that night defies easy explanation. He drove in all 5 Yankee runs. He hit a 3-run home run. He finished the game with a 2-run single in the bottom of the 9th inning to win the game 5-4. Every run, every point on the board for the Yankees that night came from the man who had buried his friend that morning. The win was described afterward as cathartic, which is the kind of word people reach for when they do not have a better one. It was not cathartic. It was something stranger and more human than that word captures. The locker Munson used was preserved exactly as it was. When the Yankees moved to their new stadium years later, the locker came with them. It sits empty to this day, a permanent installation in the clubhouse of the most famous baseball franchise in the world, a reminder of what was lost and of who the anchor was when the ship was at its most turbulent. Thurman Munson's absence from the Baseball Hall of Fame is an argument that has not gone away, because the numbers keep making it louder every year. His 7-year peak WAR of 37.0 is higher than the average for catchers currently inducted. His career WAR of 46.1 is not far from the average. He achieved more across 11 seasons than many catchers who played for 2 decades. His postseason average of 357 stands as one of the most impressive records of October performance in the history of the position. The obstacle is the narrative. The writers who vote for the Hall of Fame spent years sitting in front of Thurman Munson and getting silence or single words in return. They built a story around that experience, and the story followed him well beyond his death and beyond every statistic that argued otherwise. It is the most lasting consequence of a wound Darrell Munson opened when his son was still a child. But legacies are not only built by voters, they are built by what people remember and by what a life actually meant. Thurman Munson led the New York Yankees to 2 World Series championships. He was the first captain the franchise had named in decades. He hit in the clutch when it mattered most. He protected his teammates with a ferocity that was almost paternal. And every day, he climbed into that jet and flew home to Canton. He was trying to be something his father never was. He was trying to give his children the thing that had been withheld from him, which was a father who showed up. The story of number 15 is not a story about a plane crash. It is a story about a man who spent his entire life catching for others. His pitchers, his teammates, his captain's role in a clubhouse full of enormous personalities. And always, at the center of it, his family, the people he was flying home to be with every chance he got. The reason he was at that airport on August 2nd. The reason he kept going up when everyone who loved him was telling him to stop. He spent his life catching for everyone around him, and in the end, There was simply no one who could catch him when he finally fell. His name deserves to be remembered. Like and subscribe if this story meant something to you, and leave a comment below. Thurman Munson was one of the greatest to ever put on a catcher's mask, and he deserves every voice still speaking his name.